So moving on from the diencephalon, we have the brainstem at the inferior side of the brain. So this is the brain structure that joins the rest of the brain with the spinal cord. So in much the same way that the diencephalon is organized, we see that the brainstem structures are mostly clusters of nuclei. So that these nuclei are masses of neurons that have a specific function associated with them. We see three brainstem structures also, just like we saw with the diencephalon. We see the midbrain, that is the superiormost part of the brainstem. It's found just underneath the diencephalon. We have the pons that makes up the middle of the brainstem, and finally the medulla oblongata is found at the inferiormost aspect of the brainstem. So as a whole, the brainstem contains centers for autonomic nervous system functions, so it is highly involved in controlling homeostasis. We also see that there's a number of tracts or bundles of neuron axons that are carrying information between the brain and the spinal cord and kind of various other regions of the brain. So we see that these tracts extend between the higher levels of the brain, so like the thalamus and the cerebrum, extends from the cerebellum and from the spinal cord. And so we see that the brainstem has tracks that connect all of these different regions of the brain to one another so that they can communicate and coordinate the functions of the brain. And we also see that the brainstem contains the majority of the cranial nerves. So of the 12 cranial nerves that emerge from the brain, we see that 10 of them are associated with the brainstem. So looking at a lateral view of the brainstem, we can see the midbrain, just a little part of the midbrain. We can see the majority of the pons and the majority of the medulla oblongata at the inferior aspect of it as well. So everything that's below this in the tan color on the diagram here would be the spinal cord. Turning this structure around, we take a look at it from a posterior view, and if we remove all of the other brain structures, so particularly the cerebrum and the cerebellum, we see these four mound-like structures that are associated with the midbrain, and these are actually four nuclei, or I should say two pairs of nuclei within the midbrain itself, or that make up a large part of the midbrain. So let's take a look at what those are. So the midbrain contains these two large pairs of nuclei. One set is located superiorly, the other pair or set is located inferiorly. The superior pair is referred to as the superior colliculi, and so these structures coordinate visual reflexes, and these are the reflexes that occur when you visually track a moving object. So what we see with this reflex is that the head and the eyes are moved in a coordinated fashion so that you can track that moving object across your visual field. The inferior pair are referred to as the inferior colliculi, and these function as auditory relay centers for sensory information that's going from the ear to the auditory sensory cortex of the cerebrum, where they can be interpreted. We see that these also act as auditory reflex centers that control the turning of the head during unexpected loud sounds, and particularly sounds that originate from our lateral sides or from behind us. So those are the major structures of the midbrain. So let's move on to the pons. So the pons, as we've described before, is this kind of wedge-shaped, or this region that's kind of wedge-shaped, and it's found between the midbrain, which is above it, and the medulla oblongata, which is below it. So the pons, the name of the pons means bridge, so it literally translates into, it's literally translated into bridge. And so this name actually suits its function pretty well, because we see that the pons is mostly made up of neuron axon tracts, and these tracts function to carry messages between the brain and the spinal cord, or between the motor cortex of the cerebrum and the cerebellum. We also see that some of the nuclei that are within the pons are involved in maintaining a normal breathing rhythm. And this is actually a function that's coordinated with the medulla oblongata as well. So the pons and the medulla have these centers, these nuclei, that assist in coordinating and maintaining a normal breathing rhythm. And last but not least, the medulla oblongata is this cone-shaped structure that we see joining the remaining parts of the brainstem, it's mostly attached to the pons here. And we see that the medulla oblongata sits between the pons and the spinal cord here. Functionally, the medulla oblongata acts as an autonomic control center for maintaining things like heart rate and force of contraction of the heart, so how hard the heart is beating and how forcefully it's pumping blood through its chambers. We also see that it, along with the pons, it helps to maintain a normal breathing rate, as well as depth of breathing, so how shallow or how deeply are you breathing. And we see that it also regulates actions of things like swallowing, sneezing, coughing, vomiting, and hiccuping. And so you'll see that because it has a lot of autonomic control functions as well, that it actually shares a lot of similar functions with the hypothalamus. And the reason for that is that in order to relay its messages to the rest of the body, the hypothalamus actually uses the medulla oblongata, or uses the tracts that are located within the medulla oblongata to relay its messages to other parts of the body. And so this is why we see that the hypothalamus and the medulla have pretty similar functions to one another, because the hypothalamus is actually communicating to the medulla oblongata in maintaining these functions.